In this section, we'll look at time deposit accounts and inflation. Another type of account that pays interest is called a certificate of deposit. The good positives for a CD is generally they're issued from a bank that has the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation backing. In the event that the institution goes out of business, you will get your money out of that. They do pay a higher interest rate than a regular savings account or an interest-bearing checking. Part of a certificate of deposit requirement is that the money needs to be in the account for a designated amount of time, and it can be as short as perhaps 3 months and as long as 5 years or even longer. Downside is it does require a minimum deposit. The bank is counting on this money being there, substantial amount of money being there, so that they can in turn then use it to make money on your money. And should you need this money and withdraw before the maturity date, it is subject to a penalty, which is typically the last interest or so that's earned. Here's a table of some CD rates being paid currently. We can see here we have 3 months at $500 is earning 1/10 of 1%. If we drop down, we can get a 0.35% for a 2-year CD, but a $10,000 minimum deposit needs to be made. And here at the bottom, to get a 1.25% interest rate, you need to sign up for a 5-year deposit of $10,000 or more. Compound interest table for longer periods. We will look at daily compounding for more than just 1 day up to 90 day, and we need a table for that. We can always use the formula, but the table saves a little bit of time, and here we have a table showing the number of years and the interest rates for the compounded daily. In this example, WC wants to deposit $4,000. His account is paying 5% compounded daily, certainly not something that's happening for us currently. And the question is, should he leave it in there for 2 or 3 years? So we will determine what that value is for both of those possibilities. Using the compound interest for time deposit accounts compounded daily, we'll look up 2 years and corresponding with 5%, here's our multiplier. We will times that by 4,000 and see that the account has grown to $4,420.65 versus if the money is in there for another year tied up, can you stand to not have access to that money versus the gain in this account? And we're talking a little over $200 additional interest is earned by having it in there in 3 years. And this is a decision you need to make when you're taking out a certificate of deposit. Know that you don't want to put money into an account for 2 or 3 or 5 years, whatever the case may be, that it's your emergency money that you may need to pull it out. It's money that it's much better that you know you won't be replacing the car, you have emergency funds available to you, and so that you won't be cashing out. Not that it's the worst thing in the world, but should go with shorter lengths of time and sacrifice your interest rate to avoid having to cash it out early and paying a penalty. The other topic in this section is dealing with the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of our inflation. And inflation is a rise in general price levels of goods and services. And we can illustrate here what inflation actually does. In 1950, if you had $100,000, today, or at least in 2015, you would need almost $1 million to have the same purchasing power that you did in 1950, 65 years later. The measure of inflation here in the United States is called the Consumer Price Index, and it's based on a series of standard goods and services. It's a common bundle that they calculate from one year to the next. What is your electricity bill and certain groceries and commuting and so on. And just as information here, last year, 2015, for the 12 months running, the United States inflation rate was 0.7%. So let's take a look at what happens when we have a current income and there's no raise, but we have an inflation or consumer price index increase of 4%. If that was the case, this individual would have to have, instead of $23,000, they would have to have $23,920 to have the same buying power because of that 4% inflation factor. And where is the 920 coming from? If you take the current salary times the inflation factor of 4% as a decimal times 1 year, that means we have an increase of $920. So what if you didn't get that corresponding 4% raise? It means you will need to trim $920 out of your current budget so that you can stay status quo and not be short on being able to pay your expenses and live at the standard that you previously were. If we have a current income of $23,000 and we saw a 4% consumer price index, we know we need $920, but what if you received a 2.4% raise? Well, it's not what you need to keep up with inflation, but at least you're not as far behind, and that $23,552 comes from taking the beginning salary at $23,000 times the wage increase of 2.4% expressed as a decimal for a year is $552. So if someone received a 2.4% raise, it's better than no raise, but it's still not keeping up with the inflation rate for that year. And so if we look at what the 4% does compared to the 2.4% raise, there's still $368 drop in buying power. To keep your level of lifestyle the same, you would need to cut $368 worth of expenditures to maintain your status quo. Here we have another example. Someone has $1,800 in a savings account for 1 year that pays 3.5% interest compounded daily. What is the loss or gain in purchase power if the consumer price index went up 3.9%? Well, we can see right now the interest is not high enough keeping up with the inflation factor here, so there will be a loss, but let's calculate it out. We have another table for 3.5% interest compounded daily, only expressed in quarters, and 1 year would be 4 quarters. So here we have our multiplier. We will find the maturity value of that $1,800 times 4 quarters, which would be the 1 year for the 3.5% interest compounded daily. So after 1 year, the balance in this account would have this value. And if we subtract off that principal of $1,800, it has made $63.22 in interest in the past year. What is the result or the impact of the inflation factor of 3.9% on our $1,800? We'll take 1,800 times 0.039, the decimal equivalency of 3.9%, and we see that the gain to have still the same buying power of the $1,800 needed to have an increase of $70.20. We can take the difference right here between the interest gained and what the inflation factor or the buying power now of $1,800 is a year later, or we can compare the inflation value of our $1,800 compared to putting it in a savings account. Either way, the difference between those two is a loss of almost $7 in buying power.